Through the Leadership Lens is sponsored by Irish Propane Corporation, serving Western and Central New York. For all your residential and commercial propane needs, choose Irish Propane. Irish Propane is a locally operated, New York State certified, woman-owned business. For more information, visit irishpropane.com. Irish Propane delivers peace of mind.
Hello and welcome to another Through the Leadership Lens, a podcast presented by the Women in Propane Council. I'm Freddie Riddler.
And I'm Bridget Kidd. And today we're so excited to introduce you all to Dr. Rebecca Boudreaux, President and CEO of Oberon Fuels. We're so excited to have you here today.
Well, thank you so much. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, so on this podcast, as you know, we talk about leadership and kind of all of the different aspects of leadership. And I'm wondering if to kick us off, would you talk to us a little bit about what leadership means to you? And then also, what type of leader are you?
Yeah, so leadership is interesting because it's hard to pin down really what it is, right? And, over my 2+ decade career at this point, leadership has evolved in what it means to me, but now it really means about facilitating people and empowering people to be the best version of themselves. And I really love strength-based leadership, which is by Gallup. And they have an assessment they do in their book, and many books written about it. But one of the things they say is that individuals can't be well-rounded, but teams can be. And I love that because it's a constant reminder we all struggle. At least I was told growing up, you need to be well-rounded. If you're bad at that, work on it. The truth is, if we really invest in our strength, that's when we can really excel and bring people around us that together we're a well-rounded team.
I love how you said empowering people around you. That's a fun way to say true leadership. Could you go into depth a little bit about that? Can you give us an example when you had to empower a team around you and they looked up to you as a leader?
Yeah, it's empowering a team. One of the things is I think about particularly the past 2 years of our company. So Oberon's a little over 12 years old now. And I think the past 2 to 3 years for everyone has really challenges in different ways. And it's really forced us to empower people and motivate them in different ways. And so one way as I think about it is our team early in the pandemic made a very, very careful decision and thought about it that we're going to have our production teams at our production facility. But then the rest of the team, they can live where they want, where they chose to be, where they felt they worked best. And so we're a remote but connected workforce. And we were very deliberate about that. And so in thinking about empowering the team, we had to rethink what does leadership look like? What does communication look like? How do you build a culture as a team where you're not all physically in one place? And so I think about over the past now almost 3 years of implementing that model and figuring out how people can work in the best situation of themselves, empowering them to be their best version of themselves, then also working together and building relationships in a virtual format, but also coming together as a team in person multiple times a year around the country.
Rebecca, I love that. And we at PERC are also predominantly a remote workforce. And I love it. And I feel like I've done my best work in pre-pandemic. This is kind of the situation we lived in. But I too am a big fan of strengths-based training and strengths-based leadership. So a question that I would have for you, and for those of our listeners who aren't as familiar with Gallup and Strengths Finders, is, one of the main focuses is imagine if we focused on people's strengths rather than their weaknesses. And I'm wondering if you could give us examples of how you've leveraged that philosophy in, really tangible ways with your team remotely, in person as well. But I think in a remote environment, that would be really an interesting takeaway for our listeners.
Yes. And even taking a step back, Bridget, for those who don't know about strength-based leadership, as you said, it's wonderful to hear that you're a fan. But I was first introduced to it about 12 years ago through a mentoring program that I was in focused on women called Women in America. They brought in someone from Gallup, a team we did the assessment. They talk through and you get your top 5 strengths. Now they actually give you all 34. But really focusing top 5, top 10. And I was shocked at what my top 5 were. And I just told somebody else, I'm like, here are my top 5 strengths. They're like, of course. I mean, that's completely obvious, but it wasn't obvious to me, right? And I think that's part of leadership, right? Is you see the potential in others and you see things that to you is often very clear, but it's not always to the other person. And so, understanding who I was and where I really I could shine, and then understanding how I could continue to invest in that. Right. But also understanding that we were talking before about individuals can't be well-rounded, but teams can be. What I also realized is sometimes the people that drove me the craziest, sometimes on my team, were the people I needed the most because their strength profile was very different than mine. And if I didn't have them on the team, I would take too long to make decisions or I'd overanalyze it. And so it was very important learning for me. And so, now actually as a company, as our new team members come in the first 90 days, they do a strength-based assessment that can help them understand their strengths and also the people who work around them, how we can best leverage their strengths. And so as, you think about, how we did that, recently, we are working on a new project and one of the, we're looking at our continued investment in the company and how we're continuing to build a company. We had a discrete project. And so in looking at the teams, our executive leadership team strengths, pulled in some of the members to work with me very closely on it. And it was great because, we figure out how we could work together. The cadence, one person was really keeping things moving. The other person was more strategic focused and just keeping that going because it's hard for one person to do it all and you really can't. And so finding that cadence and people that you can work with that can not only you make them better as a leader, but they make you better at your role in your job.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting when you look. I had a very similar experience that I realized, oh, well, there may be something to the people that I had a really difficult time working with, right? But you need that balance. And I think I'm curious if you can talk about other times in your career where maybe you have to embrace a little bit of vulnerability, right? To acknowledge that isn't my strength. Rebecca, can you talk to us about a time where you had to make a really difficult leadership decision?
Yes. So right away, I go back to March 2020. And no matter where you're in the world, at that point in time, your life was turned upside down. And it was in the US, the early days of the COVID pandemic. And we were actually in the process after 8 years, we had finally won a grant from the state of California. It was our first public funding as a company. And we were now time to scale up the company. And we were hiring members of the corporate team. And so we had to make a very deliberate decision. The world was imploding. And do we keep hiring? We're in the middle of hiring processes. Do we wait till things are better to hire? We said, no, we have real timelines that we need to move. And in many ways, we said as a team, we feel like we were built for this for the past, 9 years beforehand, that we were always having to pivot as an early stage company, not only developing a technology, but creating a market and creating the regulations to support it. You're always having to be innovative and figure things out. So we made a very deliberate decision to keep hiring and keep going the interview process, even though we didn't know what the world was going to look like. And the 2 months even after that, it was time to hire the production team. Where our facility is located, 1 in 4 people were testing positive for COVID. And there was a 25% unemployment at the time. Half of the people we were interviewing for production jobs were unemployed. And so again, the world wasn't much better than do we keep on going? But we had to get people back to work. We had to keep innovation going. And because of the grant for the state of California and the continued investment of our shareholders, we were able to hire the team. And less than a year later, that production team produced the first renewable DME ever in the US. And so it was just, as you think about now looking back 3 years and all the things that have happened since then, it's exciting and amazing to see what has transpired. But it was very scary times in making decisions when you didn't know what the outcome was going to be, much less what tomorrow was going to look like.
Yeah. And that's a lot of our podcasts that we do. It's crazy how many people tell stories about 2020. And even though it's 2023, it's still there. It's still lingering. And that's part of leadership is you have to change with time. And as time continues to grow, we have to as well. And part of growing, we have to always make sure that our leadership skills don't stall out. You can't just sit back and say, you know what, I've got a team. I'm mentoring a group of people. I'm empowering this group around me. You can't just sit back and let it ride out. We have to constantly add to that leadership. How would you say you keep yourself from stalling out with your leadership skills?
Yeah, it's interesting because as I think over my career, because I've always worked in early stage companies, I started my first company, I was 25 in graduate school and started a biotechnology company with three of my colleagues focused on making more effective forms of chemotherapy. So we were working on tackling cancer and we had come up with the innovative approach. And so that's how I got started. And in early stage companies, it's really do or die. And so there's no leadership program or management training program in the companies I've worked at, right? In those early days. So I've always had to find external resources to help me. And I mentioned one of them earlier, the Women in America program, which is based in New York City. I was actually living in San Diego when I joined that program and I heard about it. But I made the investment 3 or 4 times a year to fly out to New York and be part of that program for 3 years. And it was amazing that what I learned through that, through mentors who've been there, who are executives at some of the world's largest companies. And they hadn't had many mentors, much less female mentors, and they wanted to help the next generation. And it was really a game changer for me. And so as I've continued to progress since then, it's finding what are new ways to help me continue to develop as a leader and always challenge myself. Right now, it's mainly through reading that I've been doing that, but I've also been looking at, executive management programs or other ways, and some members of our team as well, looking at things like how do we find external resources to help us keep getting better at our job.
So Rebecca, the Women in Propane Council has a robust mentorship program. So it's nice to hear that you've had such a positive experience with a much larger program. Would you be willing to talk to us about maybe more specifics around a mentor that you had or somebody whose leadership you really model?
Yes, we're gonna take a journey back to when I was 17 years old, starting college. So that was only 12 years ago, right? No, maybe not. And when I was entering University of Southern Mississippi is where I went to college, and my parents really encouraged us that I was one of 4 children, and we all need to go to college, but there was no college fund for any of us. So they said that was the first thing to figure out how you're gonna get to school. Very fortunate that I received a scholarship from Southern Miss, and I was part of the Honors College. And the dean of the Honors College at the time was Dr. Maureen Ryan. And she saw in me things that 17-year-old Rebecca had no idea about my potential. It just really challenged me to think bigger than I was thinking. I grew up in South Louisiana, and you knew what you knew and what you saw around you, but that's all you knew. And I started college as a nursing major, and then the dean of honors college, as well as my chemistry and biology teacher, were encouraging me to, well, what have you considered a scientific career? And just trying to look at more options. And it's amazing because that's what helped facilitate me eventually change my major to polymer science, exploring the research route, getting into undergraduate research. I spent summers doing research at Princeton and MIT, and then went off to graduate school. So it was because of the encouragement to keep thinking bigger and pushing the boundaries of what things look like for me and what I could be out there. And so she was amazing, and we still keep in touch. We had a Zoom call just a few weeks ago to catch up, and I remind her that she was my first feminist icon, her and RGB. So.
Oh my gosh, what an honor! I would love.
That's
imagine
great story.
being able to have someone say that to you. That's probably incredible to hear. And it's awesome that you can recall all of that.
Yeah, and I spoke about 6 years ago at the undergraduate research symposium at Southern Miss. And I was very pregnant. I was 35 and a half weeks pregnant for my first child. So I was like teetering on my heels, like trying to stay upright. But she actually wrote, she read the recommendation letter she had written for me in college. Wow. As part of my introduction. And so it was really cool to go way back, and the things that she thought I could do, I did.
Wow, that is incredible. I've just a question that's interesting to me. What do you think it is in your upbringing, or maybe it's in your strengths profile? I don't know. You clearly are not afraid of risk, and you're not afraid of taking chances. And I mean, your history is, your career at least, and I'm sure the research you've conducted also mirrors this, is peppered with startups, like you said. And that's not for the faint of heart. Where do you think that comes from? And what would you say to somebody who's maybe considering going out on that big of a limb?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because when you look back, it never starts with the big things, right? It's the little steps you take that add up, and you look back and you're like, oh, wow, I've come really far, right? And so it's interesting because in looking back, my dad's father, my grandfather, Cajun French from South Louisiana, he was an entrepreneur. He started his own restaurant, and he has his own construction business. And then my father started a company. He was in oil and gas for 40 years. And so I had examples of trying things. And even if it didn't work out, they had given it their best shot. And so for me, even starting a biotech company in grad school, it's like, well, what's the worst that can happen? You can fail. And it's scary, but in many ways, it's easier at that age because you weren't giving up a 401k. There was no mortgage. There weren't people dependent on you. It was the easier way to get started. But I always have to continue to challenge myself on doing things that are scary. I recently moved to Hamburg, Germany, and the around the fall of 2022. And so I do not speak German. I am learning German. And this will actually only be my second language. I studied languages in school, but never was fluent in one. And so learning a new language is scary. Being an immigrant is scary, but you have to get out there. And so right now I go to workout classes completely in German. I know links, rechts, and then when they count eins, zwei, drei, and then I just know when you get to eins, you get to stop. It's still, even something small as that is scary, but I won't let myself walk out the class no matter how confused I get, because it's those small things that you just don't give up. You don't know what you're doing. That's okay. It's okay to be confused. It'll be better next time. So that's, so I just, nice. All of that to say, it's really the small steps. And then every day, even doing the little things that scare us, that maybe aren't so monumental, that just help you get comfortable with being uncomfortable.
I love the stories. I love your driving force in this conversation. This podcast has something like, you're calm about it, but yet the way you tell the stories, you're a driving force, and it's fun to hear it on this end. And I know our viewers are going to hear it too, but you're just so cool. You're like, I just moved to Germany, learning the German language, not a big deal. I can take on the world. Mm-hmm. With our viewers listening to this, what advice would you want to give them, to be you, to be that leader? Like what advice would you give someone saying, I want to be like Dr. Rebecca?
My advice is to find out your personal why. So if you haven't watched Simon Sinek's, he has an 18-minute TED Talk that has been viewed by millions of viewers. And when I watched that, he talks about start with why. This was his first book. He's written many books now. But it's all about why you do what you do as an individual, what drives you, what you're passionate about, and then why companies exist. What is that driving force for a company? And for me, understanding my personal why is to leverage my scientific skills to solve big global problems. really, for me, I'm very passionate on energy, health, and girls empowerment. That's where I really want to leverage my scientific skills. And so once you find what drives you, find an opportunity to do that in your professional life, that's what keeps you going, right? That keeps you going in the really difficult times when you really don't know what's going on. And, in those early days of the pandemic, we're still wiping down our groceries. Little did we know it was going through the air. and you're trying to figure things out. Those times when you're, 25 years old, starting a biotechnology company and having no idea what you're doing. I actually taught myself finance by reading the Complete Idiot's Guide to Accounting, because someone had to manage the finances for our company. So that's how I learned accounting. It's actually a fabulous book. I still have it. But, just those times that are so scary and hard, what keeps you going is if it aligns with your personal values, your personal why. So for those out there, if you haven't seen the Simon Sinek talk, I highly encourage it. It's 18 minutes well spent, and then maybe it'll lead you to reading some of his books. But figure out your personal why, what drives you, and then try to find in your professional career a way to align you with that as well.
Find your why. I like that.
I want to ask another question for you that just kind of came to me as you're talking. And oftentimes we focus on, and it's better, right, to focus on the things that worked and went well and looking back on that. But that's not everyone's experience, right? And it's very rare that everything you try works and you hit a home run every time. What would you say, one of the audiences that we want to reach are those people who are maybe new to an industry or looking to make a change. That's scary. And it's scary to make a change because you could fail. And that fear of failure is real for a lot of people. Have you had a time where something really tanked? I mean, really flopped, and kind of how did you pick yourself back up and say, I mean, my list is quite long. So, I mean, what could you, how do you pick yourself up and say, yeah, it is going to be better, and here's how?
Yeah. Well, how much time do we have to talk about failure? So, it's interesting. As I think about, was it a failure? Was it getting it wrong? And I'm not sure. So in graduate school, in your first year of graduate school, you pick a graduate advisor. And I started with a graduate advisor, and about 2 years in, it really just wasn't working. And I didn't feel like in that current research group, for a variety of reasons, the project was on and everything, that I was the next 3 more years that I was going to continue to grow and develop. It just wasn't the right fit. And so I had a decision to make, and I said, okay, I can, admit that this isn't working and make a change, but then I had to start my graduate research all over 2 years in. Or I could just, hem and hum along, but it's going to be really miserable if I'm not growing. So I made the decision to admit that it had not gone right. Went to the chair of our department at the university and said, look, this isn't working. I'm not quitting graduate school, but I need to switch research groups. And they said, he was very supportive, said, okay. And so I talked with other professors and started with another professor, started my graduate research all over after 2 years.
Yeah.
And so it was hard, but it was the best thing that happened. I had to admit that this wasn't working, and I could have stayed there and it just been him-haw, not so great. But I made a difficult decision, and looking back now, it's the best decision I made, because I got in a new research project and really was able to publish scientific papers in it, and just got to work at the interface of chemistry and biology on an area that I was very passionate about. But the first step is in many ways I failed. I hadn't gotten it right the first time. And that's hard. But, sometimes these things, they have a way of teaching you things, and, you can take that, okay, what went wrong there? And now you think professionally, you pick up things all along the way that can help you be better and make better decisions the next time.
Yeah. And I think it's so easy to say like, oh gosh, that was a failure, or I could have done something so differently. And I think that's an important part of the process to make it better than a failure. But I know with my kids, and I'm sure you guys with yours, you say these things like you learn so much more from failure, which is great to say. And it is the reality, but it's a tough pill to swallow too.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I would say that, going through even with Oberon, over our history of, applying for grants, for example, and really having new market development on how renewable DME can help companies and industries decarbonize, there were a lot of failures along the way, applying for grants and pouring your heart and soul in things and just not getting it and just having to keep moving on.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, what do you think, Bridget? Is it time for the whip around? Awesome. So we call this the whip around, or the Women in Propane. It's just a fun little thing we like to finish these podcasts with, to kind of step in outside of your comfort zone a little bit and ask you some random questions and see
Awesome.
how you'd answer them. So with that being said, I'll start this one. If you could go back to your 16-year-old self, what'd you say that was, like 12 years ago or something like that?
Yeah, 13.
13. If you go back to your 16-year-old self, what advice would you give Rebecca at the time?
Yeah, people often say it's not about the destination, it's about the journey. And I think in many ways it's not about the destination, it's about the preparing, right? The preparation that we do. And I would have told 16-year-old Rebecca that the best thing you do is prepare for the great world that's out there. You're so focused. People say, well, what are you going to be when you grow? Well, who in the world at 16 really knew what they were going to be? There's a small fraction of the population, but everyone pivots and turns, right? And there's so much pressure versus just preparing, right? Learning the foundational things and having an idea and having a goal and working towards it, but also being open-minded about the opportunities that can come along. Because, for example, I had mentioned I did undergraduate research, and so I was actually going to go to medical school. So I was majoring in polymer science, and I got to do undergraduate research at Princeton one summer, and I was like, I really like this research. Do I really want to go to medical school? Do I want to be a research scientist? And the next summer, I had the option to go to a medical school research program or go to MIT and do research in material science. And it was at that point I had to decide. Medical school was what the plan was. That was the goal. But then I pivoted to actually go more to a research scientist route, and which eventually led me to go get my PhD. So being prepared, but being open to what's around you.
Oh, that's great. That's great advice for now. I mean, my 16-year-old self. What about if you were to write a book about your career so far, what would the title of that book be?
Well,
you can steal a title from another book too if you wanted to.
I feel like the first thing that comes to mind is The Little Engine That Could.
Yeah, that's right.
I think I can.
Right.
When you asked that question, Bridget, and just listening to Dr. Rebecca talk today and do her podcast, I thought, hang on, here we go. Yeah, great question.
Yeah, or maybe an alternate title would be, because a lot of conversations in the company start off with, I have an idea. And then run for the door.
Just great. Hear me out, ... Right.
I was thinking ... No.
Don't do that. Don't do that.
So, Dr. Rebecca, if you could describe yourself in one word, what would that one word be?
Persistent.
I like that. That's great. All right. Now, this is a tough one. What do you keep in the trunk of your car? If you have a trunk. I don't know if you have a trunk now. Wasn't your move?
Yeah. So I do have a car, but I rarely use it because I live in Hamburg, so a city of around 2 million people, and my first preference is to walk if possible. I'll have fabulous public transit, and occasionally I drive, but it's quite difficult in a densely populated city. A lot of bike riding, which is fabulous, but you got to look out for them. And all the signs are in German. So there you go.
Right.
We're getting there.
Yeah, right.
So
Okay.
yeah, there's actually nothing in my trunk.
Yeah, I mean, if you're not
Empty
using
air.
it,
I'm like, what's in my trunk? Nothing.
nothing. Yeah.
I was like, did she answer the question? I just didn't hear it. I don't think she did.
So nothing.
Dr. Rebecca, if you were a superhero, what superhero strengths would you have?
I think I really want to be able to fly. Right? Again, the whole thing. Who needs a car when you can fly? Walk
with nothing in the trunk.
What trunk? I'll wear a backpack.
A superhero backpack.
Yeah, definitely want to fly.
All right, my last one is, what is your favorite ice cream flavor?
Ooh. Well, if it's just like, the norm, right? It's gonna be, it's typically vanilla, maybe a little Butterfinger topping. Mm-hmm. But the few times I can find it, if there's cinnamon ice cream, it's just amazing.
There is a place outside Boston, in Boston, by Boston College's campus that has cinnamon ice cream that is amazing.
Well, see, I actually discovered it in Boston the summer.
Did you?
It was on campus. There was a place that had cinnamon ice cream. At least I had to walk.
I wonder if it's the same place.
It was amazing. It was like,
wow, you just had a moment.
We did. We just connected.
I'm gonna get some ice cream when we're done.
Yes. Well, thank you, Dr. Rebecca. Thanks for joining Through the Leadership Lens, a podcast presented by the Women in Propane Council. It was a lot of fun having you on the show.
This was so much fun. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yes. Well, thank you, Freddie. Thank you, Bridget. I really appreciate you having me on the show.
This has been another episode of Through the Leadership Lens, presented by Women in Propane. Be sure to subscribe, download, and share with a friend. To learn more about Women in Propane, visit us on Facebook, Instagram, or online at www.womeninpropane.org. I'm Freddie Riddler.
And I'm Bridget Kidd. Thanks for listening. Until next time.